Africa has been blessed with many of the world's natural resources, including gold, silver, diamonds, copper, cobalt, uranium, oil, lithium, and more. At times, it becomes easy to overlook that our most significant inheritance is our people and their cultural heritage. Those who have benefited from our continent for centuries have always understood this powerful truth. And that is why Patrice Lumumba, Eduardo Mondlane, Thomas Sankara, and Amilcar Cabral were assassinated. And that is why the Asantehene Nana Prempeh I and over 150 members of his clan and later Nana Yaa Asantewaa were all banished from the Gold Coast to the Seychelles. Similarly, Omukama Kabalega of Bunyoro in Uganda was also banished to Seychelles. This is why Sam Nujoma was forced into exile from Namibia, and Nelson Mandela was imprisoned on Robben Island, which was a former leper colony off the coast of Cape Town in South Africa. And this is why Steve Biko was murdered in prison. We felt the absence of these individuals and recognized the potential that we lost as a result. What I refer to in my book as the lost decades of Africa was that period from the mid to late 70s until the early 1990s, when the brain drain occurred and the continent stagnated. The median per capita growth of developing African countries at the time was 0.0%. We felt the loss of those who left to seek better opportunities for themselves and their families. These were ordinary people from all walks of life, like architects, doctors, engineers, artists, business people, bankers, and workers in the transportation and hospitality industries. Excellencies, honorable judges, imagine if Africa measured its wealth not by our natural resources, but by our people, valued individuals, free from oppression, conflict, persecution, and violence, and assured of the rights to a life of dignity, liberty, and self-determination. What would that look like? How much differently would we see ourselves? What would that wealth mean for the strength and continued sovereignty of our nations? These are not just questions for a game of what if. They are based on the reality of Africa's near future. These are questions we must ask ourselves as leaders and citizens to determine the nations we are building and the world we wish to create for our children. By 2050, Africa's population will reach 2.5 billion, and more than a quarter of the world's population will be African. By the end of this century, nearly 40% of the world's population will be African. Already the median age of the African continent is 19, compared with nearly 45 in the European Union and 39 in the United States. Can we imagine the power we hold in our hands? Technological advances have made the world feel like a small place. At no other time in our lifetime was that more evident than during the COVID-19 pandemic. By the time the World Health Organization announced the discovery of a new virus in Wuhan, China, that virus was already on an aeroplane to Johannesburg. It was already present in Accra on the roadside as individuals waited for a truck roll at the Kwame Nkrumah Circle, or seated towards the rear of a daladala en route to Ngaramtoni. If you look beyond Africa, what you find is that that facade of the so-called Global North, a group of countries that have long held themselves up as beacons of democracy and human rights, of liberty, justice, and the rule of law, is fast crumbling. Judiciaries are no longer independent. Citizens and lawful residents are being disappeared by mass law enforcement and then placed without due process indefinitely in detention centers. We see executive overreach and a steady weakening of legislative independence. We see violations of international law. Restrictions are being placed on freedom of speech assembly and protest, there is a general loss of liberties and a sharp decline in public trust in governments. Mwalimu Julius K. Nyerere famously said, "One does not judge one's state of health by comparing yourself to a sick person." For far too long, we compared ourselves to the West and used what we believe were their standards as our benchmarks for all our endeavors. The reality we see today should serve as a clear call to action. What should be our paradigm in understanding and interacting with the rest of the world, even as we preserve our dignity and cultural identity as Africans? Honorable judges, ladies and gentlemen, I call upon African Union member states who have not yet ratified the protocol to please do so without delay. To my colleagues, heads of states in these countries, I assure you that you have nothing to fear from this court. I humbly ask all African nations and individuals to respect and implement the court's judgments in good faith, and to also make the declaration to allow individuals and non-governmental organizations direct access to this court. My father's political tribulations did not end with his detention after he wrote his unsolicited letter advising the head of state. He had to live in exile again for 13 years after another coup d'etat. But many others suffered even greater injustice and abuse of their rights and dignity. Many individuals have endured significant hardship throughout their lives. The Lumumbas, the Modlanis, the Sankaras, the Cabrals, the Prempes, the Yasantuas, the Kabalegas, the Nyomas, Mandelas, and Bikos are all recognized as martyrs of the African Revolution. The African Court of Human and People's Rights existed earlier in our past. These grave instances of human rights abuses and injustice would have been a very important case for you to adjudicate. We would have secured justice against racist apartheid criminals, colonialists, and even our own oppressive African dictators who tortured and sent many of their countrymen to death, and countrymen and women to death. As I said earlier, all the nations on the African continent are each other's keeper, and I truly believe this. I also believe that each of us is a keeper of the dreams and hopes of our ancestors, hopes and dreams that they could not achieve. We've paved the way for their dreams to be realized, if not by us, then by generations succeeding us. Justice systems in Africa have strengthened over the past decade. In Ghana, we're strengthening our own judicial systems. As I stand and recollect my youth and my fear for my father through my recurring nightmares, I realize that I can put those fears to rest. For the past 20 years, we've had a court that can protect the rights and dignity of African people beyond the borders of our individual nations. So allow me to say, while I'm here in this historic city of Arusha, a city well known as a site where human rights are affirmed and the dignity of African people is protected, that the time for Africa is now. Now is the time for us to meet the challenge of keeping the promise we have made to future generations, promises we have signed and pledged to uphold. Now is the time to deepen our commitment to the court, so that in 20 years from now, when we celebrate its 40th anniversary, it will stand as the leading international judicial body and a model for others. My lords, ladies and gentlemen, now is the time for Africa to step into its greatness. Excellencies, honorable judges, ladies and gentlemen. But before I begin, let me pay my compliments to the Tanzanian police band for your very spirited performance. I've seen performances by police bands, but I must say this is classic. Because normally when you see a solo performance, it is normally with a saxophone. This is the first time I've seen a trombone played with such dexterity, and so I wish to compliment you. I'm going to deliver the keynote address, but it's going to be a short speech, not long, because I was vice president from 2009 until 2012, and my president was the late president of the Republic of Ghana, John Evans Atta Mills, and he was a man of brevity, and he liked to tell a joke which had a tremendous influence on me, and so I don't speak for too long. It was about this conference where people were supposed to speak, and there was one speaker who spoke for so long, more than an hour and a half, and as he spoke, people started leaving the hall and leaving the hall. And so by the time he said in conclusion and was wrapping up his speech, there was only one person left in the hall. So he walked up to him and said, "I thank you very much for showing me such respect and waiting to listen to my entire speech." And he says, "I didn't stay because of respect for you. I stayed because I'm the next speaker after you." And so I'll inflict this very short keynote address on you. I'm truly honored to join you this afternoon for the official opening of the 2026 judicial year of the African Court on Human and People's Rights. I must also acknowledge that this experience is somewhat daunting. Standing before a panel of judges is admittedly quite intimidating. For many people, this might be their worst nightmare. And perhaps I'm drawing from my own experience, because as a teenager growing up, I often dreamt of my father standing before judges awaiting the decision on his fate. He was detained once and faced the risk twice more, and these fears led to recurring nightmares about him. Honorable judges, I extend my deepest gratitude to you for inviting me to address the court today as your guest of honor at the opening of the judicial year and the launch of the court's 20th anniversary. I'm grateful because this institution and its commemoration hold deep personal significance for me. My connection to these themes is rooted in my family's history, which has shaped my own perspectives on justice and human rights. I've spent much of my life reflecting on justice, due process, and the rule of law. Why are these rights afforded to some and not to others? The same applies to human rights and dignity, which have been on my mind in recent days since I received your invitation. February 24th, last week, was marked another anniversary. It was the 60th year since the 1966 coup d'etat in Ghana that overthrew the government of Ghana's first president, Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. My father was a minister of state in Nkrumah's government. Immediately after the coup, he, along with other ministers of state, members of parliament, and other government officials, were asked to report to the police station for their own safety. At the police station, he was interrogated, taken into custody, and he remained in detention for over a year. By 1974, just 8 years later, Ghana, through another coup, was being led by our fifth head of state and third military ruler, Colonel Ike Achampong. At that time, my father had become a private citizen and was working as a rice farmer and agribusinessman with no involvement in politics or government. He was a staunch believer in democracy and he opposed coup making. But he appreciated Colonel Achampong, whose policies promoted Ghana's self-reliance. He believed that Achampong had Ghana's best interest at heart. Like many parents, my father and I as well often offer unsolicited advice. It starts with our own children, and eventually we extend this unsolicited advice to friends, to neighbors, to strangers, and in my father's case, even to the head of state. My father decided to write a letter to the head of state, Colonel Achampo, to let him know that he was doing a wonderful job of leading Ghana. In that letter, he offered, as usual, his unsolicited advice. And he said, and I quote, "But do not hold on to power for too long. Leave when the applause is the loudest," my father wrote. He sent the letter, and soon after, military personnel arrived at our home and took my father into custody for questioning. He was detained for several days on suspicion of subversion. But later, Colonel Achampo ultimately determined that he posed no real threat and ordered his release. Although I stand before you as a head of state, I remain the child whose father was detained for serving his country and advising its leader. I'm still the little boy who learned how dangerous it can be to challenge those in power, who may act with impunity and assume the role of judges, jury, and executioner over you. And therein lies my belief and respect for the rights and dignity of people. Your Excellencies, honorable judges, ladies and gentlemen, I share my father's story to illustrate that while he was one individual, his experience demonstrates that no one stands alone. The effects of social injustice and human rights violations extend beyond individuals. They impact entire families and communities. Although our continent comprises 55 sovereign nations, our destinies are closely linked together. Globally, many still view Africa as one single entity and refer to us collectively as Africa. Is it any wonder that they do that? Look at the synergy that existed between us during Africa's era of liberation. One nation after another in quick succession declared freedom from colonial rule. Then again, when coup d'etats became fashionable, that tendency spread like a contagion through nearly every nation. We are each other's keepers. And this is why we need an institution that serves all but is beholden to none, the African Court of Human and People's Rights. Let us now consider the institution that safeguards our values and rights. Over the past 2 decades of its operation, the African Court of Human and People's Rights has proven time and again that it has the fortitude and courage to recalibrate our moral compass. We need that kind of oversight so that we remain observant and respectful of the rights and duties enumerated in the articles of the Banjul Charter, to which all the continent's nations are signatories. That charter complements this court's mission. And so now we must empower the court to be the institution that stands guard over those ideals, protecting and preserving our greatest inheritance. And I'm proud that Ghana has contributed its share of legal minds to this august court over the years. Justice Sophia Akufo served from 2006 to 2014 and rose to the position of President of the Court. She later served as Chief Justice of Ghana from 2017 until her retirement in 2019. Justice Dennis Ajay, a countryman and a respected member of Ghana's Supreme Court, is currently serving a 6-year term following his 2022 election.
Brothers and sisters of the African continent, what are your thoughts on this video? Subscribe, like, share, and give us your valuable thoughts on the comment section below. Thank you.
So there is a commemorative plaque that the President of the Court will present to guests of honor. The plaque symbolizes your distinguished participation in this ceremony. There is a second gift. There is a wooden carving that the President will present to you. We are in the land of the Big Five here, as you have. So this carving depicts the Big Five.